Welcome to the Chronological Bible Journey, where we discover God's whole story one day at a time. I'm Michael. I'm here with Ben today, and we're going to be your guides as we talk about Ruth 1 through 4. It is day 97. Ben, let's hop into this.
All right, we are in the book of Ruth, but still in the Judges era. And how do we know that? Verse 1 tells us, in the days when the judges ruled in Israel. It's a pretty easy way to segue.
I love it when the Bible is clear.
Very clear. So we are in the midst of the Judges. Now, it is assumed that this is happening late within the Judges period, but we're not for sure. The reality is we can attest that as we read through Judges, we recognize that the people of God were far from God, and they went through that sin cycle that we've talked about over and over and over again. We start with the characters or the individuals in this story. Elimelech, who's a husband, married to Naomi. They have two sons, Mahlon and Chilion, and their wives, Orpah and Ruth. So we have this family, and then a famine breaks out. That famine causes them to leave Bethlehem, pretty interesting Bible city. We have a lot of history there. And then also they go into a foreign land so that they can in turn hopefully find some food. Now, while they're in the land, that's where they meet Orpah and Ruth, and the sons marry those Moabite women that are foreigners. And what happens as the story goes, Elimelech dies first, and then the two sons die. And so what you have left are three widows.
Yeah, the beginning of this book is just filled with pain and hurt. Yeah. Just verse after verse, starting with the famines and then having to move countries and then losing your husband and sons.
Right. With no heir.
Yeah.
And I think that is a critical piece because in this culture, the birthright flowed through the sons, and there were no sons to speak of.
And no one to provide for them because widows had no ability to provide for themselves.
That's
so
exactly right.
It's a pretty bleak situation.
Yeah, and I think we see the bleakness of the situation in verses 20 and 21. If you don't mind, would you read those verses for us?
"Don't call me Naomi," she responded. "Instead, call me Mara, for the Almighty has made life very bitter for me. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me home empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has caused me to suffer and the Almighty has sent such tragedy upon me?"
Man, you can hear the desperation and the brokenness in her words.
Yes.
And I think what's so interesting here is that she chooses to change her name, or she wants to be called something else. She wants to be called Mara, and she says, because the Almighty has made life very bitter for me. Well, Michael, throughout the Old Testament, so far in the story, we've heard that the names mean something and they are significant. And even the Lord changes the names based on a person's character or their circumstances or situations that they're walking through. We see Abram, which names means high father, changes to Abraham, which means father of many nations. Sarai, which means my princess, so I think this is really interesting, goes to a more general form of princess to Sarah, which just means princess. She went from Abraham's princess, if you will,
to everybody's
princess, the princess of that great nation that would become Israel. And then we know Jacob, who was born, it says Jacob means to follow, to be behind. And then when he wrestles with God, God changes his name to Israel, which means one who prevails with God. So names are important to the people of the Old Testament. And here Naomi, in the midst of her suffering, wants to change her name. And in that, you can see how this tragedy has impacted her life. And I think sometimes we have to understand that tragedies impact our lives in significant ways. We don't necessarily change our names, but it really changes how we look, or it could even change the complete trajectory of our life.
Well, and for her, she was saying that this tragedy has defined me. It has redefined who I am. And that can often happen when something hard happens, that we allow it, that the rest of our life, we are completely different because of it.
Yeah, her identity changed so much so that she was willing to change her name. So thankfully, that's not the end of the story. The famines that were in the land of Bethlehem are now over, and so they travel back home, but not before saying goodbye to Oprah, who was with Naomi and Ruth. She went back to her family, and then Ruth said, I will not leave you. And they cling to one another, and then they go with her. It says that Ruth was determined to go with her and said nothing more. I love that idea. It says, your God will be my God. Whether you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord punish me severely if I allow anything but death to separate us. Now that is commitment.
May we all have someone in our lives that is that committed to us.
Right. And so she was willing to leave what she knew, the culture, the family, and maybe even the language that she grew up with, and to follow Naomi into this new land. And this is where we find in Ruth chapter 2, we see that because widows have no way of providing for themselves, they have to really enter into the fringe, the vulnerable of the community, and they have to find ways. What's awesome is that even in the midst of this, God has provided through the laws that He will find a way to provide for those that are most vulnerable and most needy. It says in verse 2, it says, one day Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, let me go out into the harvest fields to pick up the stalks of grain left behind by anyone who is kind enough to let me do it. And Naomi replied, all right, my daughter, go ahead. So Ruth went out to gather the grain behind the harvesters. As it happened, she found herself working in the field that belonged to Boaz, the relative of her father-in-law, Elimelech. Now, what's critical is it's not even mentioned here, but what we learned through the law is that as the gleaners, the harvesters were going through the fields, they were not to take the corners. They were not to pick up anything that was dropped. They were to leave that for the needy.
I remember that specific episode when we were working through the law and we said, here, remember this passage because this is going to be where the Lord provides for Ruth.
And He did, and He does, and it's amazing to see what God was doing even here. And what's amazing is, we say it's coincidence, but it's not. The field that she actually ends up in is Boaz's field, who is the relative, who law would say is our kinsman, Ruth's kinsman's redeemer, which is another way that God has provided for the vulnerable, for the widows, so that they are not left without. So in this day, by the law, when somebody is widowed, it is a responsibility of the closest relative to step in to marry the widow, to carry on the name of the deceased so that they do not lose their inheritance in Israel. And Boaz is not the closest relative, but he is a relative. So he is not really required to purchase back the land or to marry Ruth. So he has to go before the elders that we read in our reading and actually go before them, ask the closest relative, their kinsman redeemer, will you do this? And I love the kind of the interaction there that takes place. He says,
really worked that out.
He did.
To make it to surprise him with the full knowledge so that he would not take it.
Exactly right. He's like, well, it's like, I can't risk my family's inheritance to take on this other person. So he says, I cannot do this. And then Boaz so happily says, I can do this. And he does. And he purchases the land and he marries Ruth.
He was very shrewd in that moment to work that out.
Yeah, and it worked out into the favor of Ruth and really the descendants that would come after. I love the last phrase of our reading today. It says, and may the Lord give you descendants by this young woman who will be like those of our ancestor Perez, the son of Tamar, and Judah. What we see here through Boaz and through Ruth, we see that Messiah is to come through this lineage, and this Moabite woman, this foreigner, is in the lineage of Jesus Christ. And we'll learn tomorrow a little bit more about that story. But what I want to highlight here for us is in Boaz, we see a man who was willing to follow after God's law even when it wasn't popular, Even in an era when everybody was doing right in their own eyes, he stayed true to God. And may we today stay true to him, even in the midst of our walk, that we will follow after him day by day, even when it's not what the rest of the world is doing.
And unlike many of those judges, he seemed to actually know the law
That's right.
and obey it.
Amen.
What a great reminder today that no matter our circumstances, the Lord sees us and the Lord works out our circumstances for us. If you are at home and you know of someone who may be walking through something very difficult right now, hey, think about sharing this episode with them to bring them a little bit of hope that the Lord sees them and that the Lord is working things out on their behalf. Hey, thank you for joining us today. We are looking forward to seeing you again tomorrow.